So, if you don't know me, I'm Becky and I help curate the events programme at the St Bride Foundation. It's just really lovely to have you all here today on this lovely cold last day of January day. It's payday, it's February, there are signs of spring, so it's just really, really exciting to look forward to the year and look forward to the brilliant Bob speaking in a bit once my boring intro waffle is over. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's joining us online. I'm looking down there because that's where the Zoom head controls are. So big shout out to say hello to you guys. I know we've got people joining us from Canada, Australia. A really global, international audience is always an amazing thing. And I'll thank the pandemic for that one thing, to be able to bring you all into this hall, which is just something we've always wanted to do more of. So if you didn't know, all ticket sales from talks like this go to keep the library running for future generations to enjoy. So thank you so much to you all for supporting us in this way. We really appreciate it, and just keep coming to talks, keep supporting us. It honestly makes a huge difference to what we do here. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Google and the Wink and Word Charitable Trust for sponsoring this lecture. And this is just a note for our live streaming contingents. As we are live streaming this event, please do bear with us if we do have any technical difficulties with the lecture. If this does happen, we will try to rectify this as soon as possible. For anyone on Zoom, if you are having issues, the good old technique of turning your computer off and on again does generally do the trick. This happens at least once or twice every lecture, so please do try that. And if not, and if you can't get onto Zoom or there are issues, then we are recording this and we will send the link out to everyone in the room and everyone on Zoom who's bought a ticket as well after the event, so you can watch it again in your spare time, or if you've missed it or had to run out at the last 10 minutes, then you're covered. So please can all our Zoom attendees make sure you're muted so that we don't interrupt the live stream and, more importantly, Bob's talk. And for in-person guests, please do make sure that your mobile phones are turned off on silent. We don't mind if you take photographs. If you want to put anything on social media, please use the hashtag Adana100. We'd love to hear what you think. And we also don't mind you taking photographs, but just make sure that a flash is not used. And for anyone in person, if there is a fire alarm, hopefully that won't happen. There'll be one continuous alarm, and the meeting point is out in Salisbury Square, which is through reception, through the archway at the end of the sort of courtyard out there, and we'll meet just outside the building work that's now happening there. If that way is blocked, you'll be directed down the staircase through the back doors over there, down past the theatre bar. You can't stop for a drink on the way. There isn't time. It's an emergency. And we'll direct you up round to that spot. For anyone at home, hopefully you've got all your own procedures in place. Just to let you know, we have got an amazing Adana exhibition to go with this talk, curated by the brilliant Bob. I think I'm going to say brilliant Bob a lot this evening. I do love an alliteration. So we have an amazing exhibition on downstairs that is celebrating 100 years of Adana. This is open until the 24th of April, and it's open from 11 till 5 every day. But please do phone in advance, because sometimes that room is booked. So it's generally open, so do pop in on the off chance, but do phone ahead if you're planning to come in from a long way. I'm really excited. I haven't actually seen it, and I know there's lots of amazing bits from our library archives upstairs, as well as some prints that people have sent in. So it's just going to be a really, really small but absolutely jam-packed gem of a exhibition. And if you like this talk and would like to come to more of our talks, we have a few things coming up and lots more to be announced very soon. On the 22nd of February, we'll be joined by designer and activist Clive Russell, who will be discussing if design can make the world a better place. Clive was one of the founding members of the Extinction Rebellion art group, and I think it's going to be a really interesting and eye-opening talk into how we can make the world a better place, what we can do through our creativity, and see that through the lens of what he does with the Extinction Rebellion, but not only that, alongside his other work that he does as well across a lot of different fields. It sounds fantastic. I think it's going to be a really good one. I say that about every talk, but generally they all are blooming amazing, so come along if you can. And we have, after that, on the 7th of March, it's the first iMagazine Type Tuesday of the year, so do save the date. Details will be coming soon about that too. And then on the 30th of March, Michele Patan and Riccardo Orcolo will be joining us for an evening centred around designing type revivals. And again, judging by ticket sales, that's another one you don't want to miss if that is your thing. And I would also like to remind you that our library reading room is closed for February while we carry out some work, some other bits and pieces going on behind the scenes to make your experience even richer when you come and visit. But it will be reopening in March as usual. And again, if you've heard all this already, huge apologies, but just to let you know or remind you that we do hold brilliant workshops in letterpress and sometimes in bookbinding, lots of tours around the building. There's lots of stuff going on, so do check out our website and see what's going on so that you can just get an even more richer St. Bride experience. I'm nearly at the end, don't worry, and then we can get on to the brilliant Bob. So just to let you know, the talk tonight will be lasting for approximately 60-ish minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So for anyone on Zoom, if you would like to ask a question, we will be coming to you as well, so just put them in the chat box and we'll go through as many as we can there. And I feel like introducing Bob for as many times as I have, how much more can I say about how brilliant he is? He is literally the font of all knowledge, and I don't think he needs much introduction apart from how brilliant he is, because I keep saying that word. So I'm going to stop now, because I think that's plenty from me. So I'm now going to hand over to Bob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Becky. Right. Having wet my whistle, let's start talking about Adana. I was 15 when I bought my first Adana. I saved up the money from my newspaper delivery round. It cost £10.15 shillings in October 1970, and I still use it today. Now, the company had been around for just 48 years at that point. I can't believe that here I am 52 years later celebrating their centenary, but how time flies. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Why Adana? Well, a geography lesson. Adana is the fourth largest city in Turkey. It has a population of 2.25 million. Its main industry is agriculture, and it is also famous worldwide for the Adana kebab. It is not famous anywhere for Adana printing presses. Although in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we were actually led to believe that's where the name came from. We'll get to the real origin of the company name in just a moment. Adana printing machines have been around for just over a century. James Moran, behind me here, in his book on printing presses, tells us that the company founder, Donald Affleck Aspinall, was selling horse racing tips by post when he came up with the brilliant idea of designing and selling small printing presses. The source of that nugget of information isn't really known, and the Aspinall family believe that it was during his convalescence from shell shock after his war service that he first encountered small printing presses during occupational therapy. He had no interest or knowledge of printing before the First World War. The post-World War II Adana company did have a habit of issuing press releases containing a fair bit of invention, so some of it has to be taken with a pinch of salt. What is the real origin of Adana's name? Well, Donald A. Aspinall, Donald Affleck Aspinall. It's a near anagram of the founder's name. Surname Aspinall, Donald A., and there's an N.A. in Donald, there's an N.A. in Aspinall. It's no more complicated than that. He liked the sound of the word. It had a sort of pleasant, exotic ring to it. So that's where Adana came from. Although that trademark was not registered with the Board of Trade until 1932, 10 years after Adana actually started trading. Printing as a hobby predates Adana by at least a century. It was a popular family pastime in the 1840s. This is from an instruction manual here at St. Bride, which was published in 1870. It shows a family gathered around a parlor press, printing poetry or some sort of instructional educational material. The printers Joseph Gould in Middlesbrough, Jabez Francis in Rochford, Essex, the Adams brothers of Daventry, and of course Edward Cooper and Charles Holtzapfel with their parlor press had all produced instruction manuals or small printing presses themselves from around the middle of the 19th century onwards. And as far back as 1769, a small pocket press was advertised in the Reading Mercury as being suitable for hobby printers. The parlour press, if we move on, looked rather like this. It was a simple wooden box into which the type was set. The paper was attached to the inside of the lid, and that simple lever created the impression. This one is actually the property of the late Susan Shaw, who founded the Type Archive, and that's currently in storage down in Stockwell. Some amateur presses were better than others. The parlour press was the most popular on this side of the Atlantic. The Americans didn't really take to it. They went for something that looks rather more like a later Adana machine, rather like the 8.5. The most successful press in America and later in the United Kingdom was this one, the cast iron model press, invented by two Americans, Clark and Doaday. It was very quickly licensed by Carlo Giuseppe Squintani in Ludgate Circus here in London. And he started importing them initially, but at a later stage they were made in London by Peter Hooker, a foundry in Walthamstow. And in fact, that fact has just come to light recently because we discovered some correspondence here at St Bride, which has been in storage for many years. And that confirms that Hookers were the manufacturers of the press. Amateur printers were not encouraged by the 19th century printing trade. Writing in 1900, Dr. Theodore Maxwell, who was a GP in Greenwich and an enthusiastic hobby printer, and also the editor of Amateur Printing magazine, warned his fellow amateurs that the trade was not always likely to welcome them with open arms. In fact, hobby printers were held in contempt by many of the large suppliers. In Philadelphia, the Printer's Circular, behind me here, actually described amateurs as evil, telling their readers that these boy printers, who had minimal overheads, were stealing the bread from the mouths of professionals. They kept up quite a campaign against amateurs across many issues of their journal, and it wasn't really much different here in the UK. In 1879, one of Britain's largest suppliers to the professional trade were deeply indignant to discover that they had been included against their wishes in a list of suppliers for hobby printers. Caslon. Well, there's irony, because Caslon are currently the largest supplier of printing presses and type to amateurs, not only in this country, but I think around the world. And I have to say thanks to Roy and Richard. A lot can change in 144 years. So this is the hero of our story, Donald Affleck Aspinall, who was born on the 13th of April, 1899. His father, Herbert, was Australian. He was born in Melbourne, but he worked in London as a solicitor. He married Lillian Smith in 1892 in what might be called a marriage of convenience, but nevertheless, they remained together for 14 years, finally separating in 1906. Donald was just 7 years old at the time of the divorce, and his mother Lillian raised 3 children on her own. Her husband must have provided financially because the census returns in 1901 and 1911 show that she employed at least one live-in servant and had independent means. That was true of her eldest son as well, and the middle son, John, who immigration records to Australia show he traveled to Australia, possibly to meet his father, who, as I said, was Australian. Donald was the youngest of 3 brothers. Cecil was born in 1892, John in 1894, and Donald arrived, as I said, in April 1899. The eldest brother, Cecil, behind me, he was apprenticed to a shipping line, but when war broke out in 1914, he was living in Australia, possibly visiting his father. He worked for a shipping line called Watts and Watts. They had 22 vessels at the outbreak of war, but they lost 13 of them through enemy action. There's a family story that he turned up at his father's office in Australia in rags, looking for work, looking for money. Anyway, he joined the Australian Imperial Force and found himself back in England a few years later in the Royal Air Force. If we move on, the eldest brother, John, joined the Royal Flying Corps. He became an air ace, shooting down 6 enemy aircraft, but at the age of just 24, he was himself shot down, killed in action on the 15th of May, 1918. Now, Donald was always anxious to join his brothers in the fight against the enemy, But as the youngest child, he couldn't sign up until he was 18. Exactly 1 week after his 18th birthday, on the 20th of April 1917, he joined the 10th Battalion of the Essex Regiment and was sent immediately to serve on the Western Front. His two brothers at that stage were serving in the Royal Flying Corps. It became the RAF in 1918. Private Donald Aspinall, service number 42943, had a deeply traumatic war service. This young lad was surrounded on a daily basis by the bodies of fallen comrades. The war diaries of the 10th Battalion of the Essex Regiment, which are held at the Public Record Office, record that on Christmas Day 1917, the Tommies were able to find a temporary billet in a derelict farmhouse where a few domestic chickens still roamed the yard. Christmas dinner was better than expected, and a rudimentary bathhouse provided hot water for the troops to clean themselves up. All of this was small comfort for an 18-year-old boy. The war diaries in the National Archives also record the daily losses of officers and men. It was a brutal conflict, and the memory of his war service would remain with Donald for the rest of his life. This is a daily report showing the deaths and casualties in his unit in October 1917. This is one day, remember, not several weeks or months. 28 killed, 174 wounded, 18 gassed, 22 missing in action. Donald would have been surrounded by the dead bodies of his colleagues, as it was almost impossible to bury them in the mud. And then there were the rats. It's clear from conversations with staff who knew him that Donald Aspinall suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. I was very fortunate because I started researching the history of Adana in the mid-1990s, and a lot of people who worked with Donald were still alive. I spoke to 10 or 12 people who had been employees working with him in Twickenham. And they all had very positive things to say about him, but his war service really never left him. He was discharged from the Essex Regiment in February 1919, 3 months after the war ended. He'd been hospitalized with shell shock and still deeply traumatized. He was believed to have used a printing press as part of his occupational therapy. It gave him an idea, and he designed a small flatbed printing press which was advertised in Practical Mechanics. Some accounts say it was the Model Engineer. Whatever it might be, I've trawled through both titles. It hasn't been possible to trace the very first advertisement for the prototype. He may have used a box number for his replies. A press release issued after World War II pardon me, tells of a boy, Donald was 21, who panicked and received a great deal of money and postal orders in response to his advertisement. And he went to Twickenham Police Station for advice. The desk sergeant said, just make the damn presses, which is what he did. Again, this is from a press release issued by the post-war Adana company, so a large pinch of salt. Adana started out in a stable block at the back of 17 Church Street. This is the main factory assembly area around 1925. It's pretty primitive. There were 2 or 3 other stables alongside. These photographs were taken for catalogue illustrations in the mid-1920s. The presses and the type, that's the sheet metal workshop with oxygen and acetylene cylinders in the back there. The presses and type were sold through premises in 34 King Street, Twickenham. Now, they belonged to a stationer called Mr. Pierce. He also ran the local library, Ingram's Library, mentioned at the top there, and he was a friend of the family. He's mentioned in Donald's wedding present list in 1928. And here is the first Adana advertisement for a massively constructed flatbed based very much upon the parlour press. That appeared in the Bazaar, Exchange and Mart on Saturday, the 25th of November, 1922. This is the first Adana advert anywhere, and I have spent so many days, weeks and months in the British Library going through magazines of the period, and there is really nothing before that. Adana was not the only printing toy to appear in 1922. The famous John Bull printing outfit was launched in March of the same year. And there is a version that you don't see very often. You'll all be familiar with the rubber stamping kit. Well, the John Bull set also provided a version which used 12-point metal printing types. It was gill sands. This was around the time of the Second World War. All cast on a monotype machine, but it didn't really catch on as the inks were water-based and didn't produce very good impressions. The earliest Adana presses, despite their glowing descriptions in advertising material, were very basic indeed. They did the job, but they had very few frills. Aspinall adapted the revolving ink disc, which was used on presses like the model, for flatbed use, and he deserves credit for that innovation. He regularly used the same headline, print, at home and earn, pound notes, with the print pound notes in a much larger point size. Major changes took place in 1923 when he engaged the services of a young engineer called Frederick Ayers. Ayers was a very talented, skilled, and inspired inventor. He created a much more professional range of machines. He'd opened his own engineering business in Kensal Rise in December 1919 in northwest London, but he'd been supplying components for Adana presses right from the very start. His most famous invention is not actually a printing press. It's a thing called a tradesman's indicator, which he was able to register as a patent. And that's one of those things that you put out for the milkman to tell him how many bottles you want in the morning. That was invented by Fred Ayers. The all-steel 45-shilling machine sold in enormous numbers, but many of the parts were bought in from companies like Fred Ayers. And so the profit margins on these presses were fairly tight. There was no mistaking its resemblance to a giant rat trap. And in fact, one member of staff said it was bound to be a success as it has caught 2 of them already. It sold, as I said, in very large numbers. The business increased steadily, and the little flatbed presses proved very popular. A part exchange scheme was set up for all the older Adana machines, and this also drove sales. The second-hand machines returned in part exchange were often resold through small ads placed anonymously by Donald Aspinall. As I've mentioned, the factory at the rear of 18 Church Street was fairly primitive, consisting of several old stables. In 1925, a small fire broke out in one of these, causing a hiatus in production. The damage was slight, but with large numbers of oxygen gas bottles and acetylene cutting equipment, it could have been disastrous if it hadn't been brought quickly under control. Fred Ayers' involvement produced the first Adana treadle presses, and for the first time, a machine which imitated the cast iron model. That patent was now in the public domain. It was Adana's first vertical platen press, but probably not the one that some of you were expecting to see. In fact, it was called the Precision Model Number 99, the Adana Octavo Platen. It was launched in 1932, at the end of 1932. It was eye-wateringly expensive at £11.15. That's almost £700 today. It didn't sell because it was simply too expensive. And it was a case of back to the drawing board, really. And what they came up with was this thing, the Adana High Speed Number 1. That was about 18 months later, with a much more favorable price, 28 shillings and sixpence. I know that's not what the caption says behind me, but the basic model was 28 and 6. It was a smaller machine with a chase area about 3 inches by 2. You could print a business card. If you were very creative and inventive and you didn't mind putting the paper through the machine several times, you could even do a letterhead or an invoice, but that would have involved multiple passes. This one is actually the improved version, which went on sale at the end of 1935 for 10 shillings more, 38 shillings and sixpence. Note at the bottom, D.A. Adana. The name Aspinall didn't really appear very often in print, in any of the promotional material. He used the alias Mr. Adana, sometimes alongside his real name, so it could get quite confusing. A much bigger machine, the High Speed Number 2, appeared the same year. The new High Speed Number 2, sometimes called the 6x4 because that was the size of the chase that held the type, sold incredibly well. It really fueled an expansion of the company. Sometimes they were sold as complete outfits, but when type was supplied, you got a very small quantity and had to come back, obviously, for for more and more. Rather like selling a printer today, an inkjet printer. The companies make the money out of the accessories and the ink cartridges. Sales were very brisk indeed. The 45 shilling machine, the steel one we saw earlier, that had shifted over 10,000 units by the end of 1928. And by 1937, Aspinall claimed that at a new press came off his production line every 8 minutes. Many of these sales were hire purchase. The claim, every man his own printer, didn't quite hold water. With professional printers having a 7-year apprenticeship, many Adana customers found that letterpress was rather too challenging, and second-hand machines started to appear regularly in quantity in various magazines, including, of course, the Exchange and Mart, where Adana had started. Hire purchase was an important source of income, but it was also something of an albatross around the neck. Cash flowed in, but there were significant numbers of defaults amongst the hire purchase customers. Nevertheless, Adana was a roaring success. By the summer of 1931, there were 100 employees, or should I say, the Adana. Everyone I spoke to about the company in the pre-war years referred to it in the definite article. People worked for the Adana. That's what they always said, but I digress. Adana was thriving. What could possibly go wrong? On Tuesday, the 18th of December, 1928, in the middle of one of Britain's harshest winters on record, disaster struck. Fire broke out at the Adana works at 10:30 p.m. that night and swept through the factory. The local fire brigade fought the blaze for 2 hours. The upper story and the warehouse for machines and stationery were saved, but the ground floor assembly area was completely destroyed. Firemen and Adana staff rescued a number of horses from the adjacent stables. But on Wednesday morning, the 19th of December, 1928, the Adana works was a smouldering ruin. Fortunately, Donald Aspinall had insurance, and the process of rebuilding began immediately. A good stock of machines had survived the fire, and he was able to support the company through the sale of these. His new company would be bigger and better. A dedicated factory was opened in Holly Street, Twickenham, for the production of printing machine rollers. Warehousing was expanded and moved to Twickenham Green. The admin office transferred to the New Midland Bank Chambers on York Street, and the factory was expanded to produce 3 new machines, the Model 1A flatbed and 2 larger machines known as number 3 and number 4 for poster printing. He also set up 2 subsidiary companies in Railway Approach, Twickenham. The Transparent Printing Company specialized in printing on greaseproof paper and cellophane. Pardon me. The company printed toffee wrappers, and Donald's son, the late Robert Aspinall, once showed me a very fine piece of printing on cellophane, incredibly detailed and exquisitely produced. This second company, Posters by Return, was established in partnership with Adana's advertising agent, Tommy Bench, to provide a trade poster printing service for small printers. All of these new developments cost money, a great deal of money. As early as 1931, Adana had serious cash flow problems. In a sense, Donald Aspinall had overstretched himself. Aspinall paid himself a handsome salary, but he was a kind and generous man who also supported family members and friends financially. In the early years of the company, all type had been bought in. Some came from Percy Walker, a local commercial printer in Twickenham who owned a monotype machine. Small quantities of foundry type came from Stevenson Blake and from Paviers and Bullens. As the Adana business expanded, Stevenson Blake supplied more and more type, allowing Aspinall the most generous trade discount, the so-called £400 rate. Surviving correspondence in the Stevenson Blake files at the Type Archive suggest a cozy relationship between Adana and Stevenson Blake, but as far as Stevenson Blake were concerned, this was strictly business. Indeed, when their typographic advisor, R.B. Fishenden, recommended further discounts to help this dynamic young man, the Sheffield founders firmly resisted the suggestion. In 1931, based upon a perceived friendship, Donald Aspinall asked Stevenson Blake for financial assistance to expand the business. He requested a loan of £6,000. That's a lot. That was around £325,000 today. Stevenson Blake, ever cautious, obtained a confidential Dun and Bradstreet report into Adana's finances. This is just part of it. They were not impressed. Two issues gave them particular cause for concern. The first was Aspinall's decision to purchase monotype machines. Now you have to realize that monotype to Stevenson Blake was rather like a crucifix is to a vampire. From July 1925, Adana had been casting a proportion of their own type on monotype machines. In exchange for the loan, Stevenson Blake wanted all monotype machines scrapped immediately. Type would be sourced exclusively from Sheffield, from Stevenson Blake. With few exceptions, any type sourced from another foundry would be purchased through Stevenson Blake, who would add 5% commission. The second concern was Aspinall's advertising spend, which was exceptionally high. The company advertised everywhere, from the Chemist and Druggist magazine to Radio Times and Meccano magazine. I have a list here of periodicals and newspapers that they advertised in, and these were big display advertisements in 1931. I won't read it all because we'll be here till midnight. A few: Daily Mirror, Daily Herald, John Bull magazine, the Daily News, the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News, the Rugby Advertiser, the West Sussex County Times, the Weekly Dispatch, and so on. It just goes on forever. These were large display ads, often full page. Radio Times had the single highest page rate of any weekly publication, and Adana were taking the back cover, the highest price of any page in Radio Times. In 1930, the annual advertising spend was £6,500. That's against an annual wage bill of just £6,000. That's an advertising spend of around £350,000 a year. However, the sales of machines and accessories for the months of April and May 1931 alone came to over £5,000. So the advertising obviously did pay off. That Dun and Bradstreet report, dated the 9th of July 1931, reveals that Adana's annual sales, including accessories and stationery, in today's terms were just under £2 million. This was a very successful company. However, Adana's outgoings were outstripping income by a wide margin. A list of conditions were laid down by Stevenson Blake, which also included placing limits upon how much money Donald could draw as personal remuneration. The conditions were simply too onerous for Donald, who rejected the terms. Despite this cooling of their friendship, the business association continued, although monotype faces gradually began to dominate Adana catalogue. Adana were publishers from an early date. The slim pamphlet on the left, Printing for the Million, was sent out with every machine. That was eventually expanded into a basic instruction manual on typesetting and printing for beginners. In January 1927, Popular Printing, a monthly journal, appeared, printed, of course, on an Adana treadle machine. Front page, you can see the machine that printed this magazine. It started well. The cover price was sixpence, and around half of that content was actually the Adana catalogue. It was a great way of getting your customers to pay for the company's price list. An issue appeared every month in 1927, but production faltered in 1928 when the magazine went bi-monthly and then quarterly. The last edition covered March, April, May, and June of 1929, when publications ceased. One of the contributors to Popular Printing was Cecil Aspinall, the brother that I mentioned earlier. He became Adana's technical guru. He wrote many of the instruction manuals and a number of publications for amateurs starting out in print. Aspinall's editorials within Popular Printing make very interesting reading. He states in one edition, Adana is the only company of its type in the whole world, and that customers in America were clamoring to subscribe to this new magazine. This didn't go down very well with Kelsey, the American equivalent to Adana, founded in 1872 exactly 50 years before Adana. William Kelsey's story had largely mirrored Aspinall's. He advertised a press which wasn't serviceable. Money poured in, but his machine didn't work either. But by 1922, Kelsey was hugely successful, selling enormous quantities of type and machines in America. Kelsey eventually bought up every single one of his major competitors. In 1923, William Kelsey, the founder, stepped down as the head of the company as Adana was being set up. Glover Snow, who was around the same age as Aspinall, took over the Kelsey company and was hugely irritated by Adana's lavish American advertising campaign. He used the same technique in America as he did in the UK. He was booking half-page, full-page display advertisements in American magazines, and people were buying Adana presses. Kelsey were annoyed by this. Glover Snow, who ran the company, anonymously bought one of Adana's presses, and he kept a detailed diary, and that survives, so we know what he thought of the Adana press, and he was not impressed, pardon the pun. He thought it was very poor indeed. He also obtained a copy of the Adana catalogue and had that shipped across to the USA. He was furious to discover that Adana was using Kelsey's advertising copy word for word. He wrote in his diary, "It is evident from going over the printed matter," that was the catalogue, "that Mr. Aspinall has some ingenuity. If he had been a little more fussy about perfecting his ideas before putting them on the market, he ought to have been able to do a very nice bunch of business." Adana's American market was initially serviced directly from the UK, but a New York agent, the Atlas Shipping Company, was soon established on Broadway, and sales were steady, although only limited stock was held in the USA. In one popular printing editorial, Donald Aspinall reports the arrest of a gang of forgers who had a number of Adana presses amongst their counterfeiting equipment. He quips, "Although we have always advocated our machines as a money-making enterprise, we did not mean it in the literal sense." He must have been quite thrilled to see that his presses were being reported as suitable to print money. In October 1938, this letter arrived at the Adana headquarters in Twickenham from the Gold Coast, now Ghana. Donald Aspinall treasured that scrap of paper, and he carried it in his wallet until the end of his short life. Mr. Kobina Forson had seen an advertisement in John Bull magazine. Mr. Forson wanted to purchase a press capable of printing, confidentially, £290,000 in currency notes. No more, no less. Why that specific sum was important to him, we will probably never know. Donald's reply, "If sent," is not recorded, but the letter amused him greatly. The original is now very fragile, but we have an enhanced facsimile copy on display downstairs. A lot of the text has faded, but you can read it quite clearly downstairs. The last known edition of popular printing is an important one because this copy behind me belonged to a 16-year-old schoolboy who'd seen an advertisement, probably in the Meccano magazine. He bought an Adana press and kept the magazine for the rest of his life. That schoolboy was Vivian Riddler, who went on to become printer to the University of Oxford. I bought Vivian's copy of popular printing after he died from Stephen Toohey, the book dealer. It's annotated with doodles and scribbles. All of the British Library copies of popular printing were destroyed in a German air raid on the night of the 10th of May 1941. Only 15 copies survive, and they are upstairs here at St Bride. I have Vivian Riddler's copy and two others which aren't here at St Bride, but that's it as far as I know. If anybody out there is aware of any other copies of popular printing, we would love to scan them and add them to the collections here at St Bride. Many other printers started their careers with Adana machines. Typographers and graphic designers, commercial artists and self-publishers all snapped up Adana's little presses. One man in particular would change the course of Adana's pre-war advertising. James Richards was partially disabled and in very poor health, but he invested in an Adana flatbed machine and set out on a mission to preserve the dying Sussex dialect by recording it in print. He called himself Jim Cladpole, a nod to another Sussexer, Tom Cladpole, real name Richard Lower, who had written books in the Sussex dialect in the early 19th century. James Richard printed several books of the Bible in the Sussex dialect and sent copies of every one to the British Library. A covering letter pasted into his first book says, "This probably isn't good enough for the British Library to keep, but perhaps one of the staff might like to take it home." Well, the British Library kept them all, together with his correspondence. Richards also sent a copy to Donald Aspinall, who immediately changed his advertising. Gone was print pound notes, instead print books. That was the new slogan. Aspinall supported James Richards by sending him occasional packages of type free of charge, although his apparently random choice of black letter faces rather marred the simplicity which had been apparent in earlier volumes. The Gospel According to St. Mark is downstairs in our exhibition. Here's somebody else who used an Adana. Another self-published, this time post-war author, is well known to anyone over the age of 40 who ever shopped on Oxford Street. This is Stanley Owen Green, a near neighbour of mine in Northolt in Middlesex. Stan lived in Haydock Green, just a short walk from my local tube station. He was a proponent of some rather curious dietary advice. In essence, if you eat too much protein, it will drive you sex mad. Moderate your protein intake and don't spend too much time sitting down. I suggest you all stand up. Otherwise, that may inflame your loins too. Stan was the famous protein wisdom man of Oxford Street, and every one of his 11-pence pamphlets were printed in his front room in his council flat on a Sunday afternoon on an Adana 8.5. Now, the press makes a gentle kerplink ping sound as the ink disc ratchet engages, and I'm told that his neighbours used to bang on the wall on Sundays to get him to stop, but they didn't succeed. And this is Stan's press. Now in the basement storeroom of Gunnersbury Museum, after several 100,000 impressions, the mainframe cracked. Unable to afford a new press to replace it, Stan constructed this bizarre cat's cradle of wire and timber to obviate the problems caused by the fracture. He actually wanted a model press originally, but was horrified at the cost. It was about 4 times more expensive than an 8.5. But this still worked with all of these gubbins holding it together, and he continued printing until the end of his life. Stan died in 1993. He terrified the life out of me. When he got his freedom pass, I used to see him on the platform at Northolt Station, and people avoided him. They all thought he was a bizarre crank, but in fact Radio 4 interviewed him towards the end of his life, and listening to the interview, he wasn't a crank. He just had some rather unusual ideas of diet. I mean, Stan lived on porridge and barley water. That was his diet. During the 1930s, Adana produced numerous presses, flatbeds, treadle machines, vertical platen models, and toys like the Adana Baby, which had first appeared in 1926, costing 5 shillings and 6pence. The Baby became a favourite toy, and a distribution deal was reached with Frank Pitchford Limited, who sold the press with a small box of 8-point Cheltenham type through Hamleys, Barker's of Kensington, dozens of UK department stores, and of course Gamages in Holborn, famous for their Christmas toy catalogue. The Baby press made the front page of Gamages' Christmas catalogue several times. Frank Pitchford, by the way, was later rebranded Velos, and they still trade today under that name. A Danish company, Sophus Berenson, distributed the little Adana press across Europe. So it had quite a reach. In addition to the many typefaces offered by Adana, was a very collectible series of 280 stock blocks. Most of them were 7Ms by 4Ms. That's about 1 inch by 3/4 of an inch. They covered all trades and included some quite bizarre examples, such as a clown with a red-hot poker in his hand. They came about as a result of a competition organized through the pages of popular printing. Letterpress offset machines, 2 models, joined the stable of Adana products. It's a curious hybrid process Right reading type or right reading process engraved blocks are printed onto a soft rubber pad, and then the object to be printed is gently rolled across the wet impression. That means you can print on toothpaste tubes, light bulbs, radio components. They were moderately successful. They didn't make a fortune for the company. Adana's advertising executive, Charles Kingston, if we can move on to the next one, described Donald as a kind of madcap inventor. Some presses were a great success, while other gadgets flopped. There was no testing of the market. Donald had an idea, it went into production, it was successful or it wasn't successful. The treadle behind me was a complete flop. Most of them were returned, and he had the great disappointment of having to send out refund postal orders for that. The machine on the left was an Adana rotary press. You turned a handle to make it work. Again, that didn't succeed and only made one catalogue appearance. But as I said earlier, from the late 1920s onwards, Adana advertising was absolutely everywhere, and every popular magazine carried advertisements. They even appeared on the silver screen. In 1936, the British crime thriller Dusty Ermine gripped cinema-goers with an action-adventure tale about Scotland Yard's pursuit of a gang of international forgers. This film is notable because it's Margaret Rutherford's first credited screen appearance. She plays a confidence trickster and a pickpocket, very out of character from the eccentric duchesses she played later in life. This film was released as Hideout in the Alps. It revolved around a gang of forgers printing crisp white fivers, we're all too young to remember them, in a secret alpine lair. When the hero, Detective Inspector Forsyth, played by Anthony Bushell, traced the location of the print shop to a ski lodge in Austria, he found that all of the presses were Adana machines. There's an Adana high-speed number 1, a high-speed number 2, an Adana treadle press, which are featured quite prominently, an early example perhaps of product placement. None of them suitable for printing money, but there'd been some sort of arrangement with Adana who'd supplied the presses. Apparently, I'm told, flyers were handed out in the cinema foyer to people who might be interested in buying Adana presses. Donald never missed an opportunity to try and make a sale. Dusty Ermine was not the only screen outing for Adana presses over the years. They've appeared in numerous film and TV productions. Ken Loach's The Wind That Shakes the Barley, rather anachronistically, uses Adana 8.5s in some scenes. Even more out of place was the high-speed number 2 press, which appears in the 2011 film Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows. Set in 1891, it includes, for no reason at all, an artfully lit and beautifully photographed picture of an Adana high-speed number 2 press. It's just there. It's not referred to. It's not part of the plot, but it's in the film. My favorite is this one, Mary, Mungo and Midge. This was an animated series made by John Ryan, the creator of Captain Pugwash, and in one episode of these programs, made in 1969, Mary, Mungo and Midge visit a printing factory where cards are being produced, greetings cards, on an Adana 5.3, top right, and Adana 8.5, bottom right. I rather suspect that John Ryan either had one or knew something about these presses. Despite the valuable publicity generated by Dusty Ermine, Adana was mired in debt. Aspinall's health broke down again and again, and he spent lengthy periods in hospital following a series of disabling strokes. The prestigious new head office at Midland Bank Chambers was closed. Pardon me. And the staff were moved back into the cramped accommodations of Church Street. The Manchester showroom at number 60 Oldham Street, which traded for a remarkable 57 hours a week, including 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 at night on Saturdays, had to be shut down. The Great Economic Depression of the 1930s had wiped out Adana's American markets. The Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 had made trading impossible by introducing steep import tariffs of up to 59%. The American market simply evaporated. In 1928, in April 1928, a new Adana showroom had opened on a short lease at 52 High Holborn. The building was due for demolition, so the lease was just 6 months and very cheap. But trade was brisk, and by 1930, the company had a permanent presence in the City of London at number 1 Ludgate House. Some of you may recognize it. On the right-hand side, it's directly opposite us. If you go down Bride Lane, on the other side of Fleet Street is the phone repair shop. That's the same shop in 1932 on the right-hand side. From Ludgate Circus, you can just see the Adana sign peeping out. I've trawled through the City of London archives, London Metropolitan Archives, to try and find a better picture of the shop, but that's the best one I've been able to come up with. So the building still stands today, just 200 yards from where I'm standing. It's only 8 feet wide, but a cellar provided storage for stock. That city store traded throughout the 1930s, but as talk of war filled newspapers and the airwaves, Aspinall was once again confined to hospital. On Saturday, the 2nd of September, Donald's deputy wrote letters of instruction to the staff in Twickenham and the City of London. The envelope said to be opened on Monday morning if war is declared over the weekend. Well, of course it was. On Sunday morning, the 3rd of September 1939, Neville Chamberlain told listeners to the BBC Home Service that Britain was now at war with Germany, and the Adana business closed down immediately. Mired in debt, Adana collapsed. They would not trade again until 1946. Adana was liquidated, and the chair of the committee to wind up the business was Percy Walker, the friendly local printer in Twickenham who had helped Aspinall so generously when he started out in 1922. To avoid the ignominy of bankruptcy, a deed of arrangement was drawn up. Aspinall cashed in his assets, including life insurance policies. He repaid a generous proportion of his debts. That's the sort of man he was. The Inland Revenue were at the front of the queue with an income tax demand of £822. That's nearly 45,000. There were 82 creditors listed, owed a total of £8,730, 12 shillings. That's just under £400,000. The roll call of debtors is one of famous names. D.L. Brothers, John Dickinson Paper Mills, Joyce and Company, Woodletter, Manders Printing Inc., Stevenson Blake, Yendall and Company. It goes on. And of course, Frank Pitchford, the distributor of the Baby Press. And Paviers and Bullens, the type foundry, who were at the same time also facing bankruptcy. Donald was discharged from hospital. He retired to Wrexham with his wife and his 2 children, Robert and Diana. He was in very poor health and would spend much of the last 8 years of his life in and out of hospital. Despite his decline, he continued corresponding with Fred Ayers about new ideas for Adana machines. His last letter to Fred was an outline description of a press he called the Adana Printall. It was another letterpress offset machine. It did go into production, but it wasn't available for very long. It found it too difficult to crack the competition at the time, and the press was quickly discontinued. A brain hemorrhage claimed Donald Aspinall's life on the 7th of May 1948. He was just 49 years old. One of the main Adana creditors was that talented young engineer, Fred Ayers, whose company, Tavistock Engineering, was owed £317, 6 shillings and 6pence. He was able to acquire the company assets, trademarks and goodwill for just £1,400. But Adana would not trade between 1939 and 1945. Or did they? Well, advertisements did appear in the press throughout the war, sporadically. Very small, no deeper than an inch in each column. And it essentially said, Adana will be back after the war, start saving. That was the extent of the advertising. Fred Ayers' own engineering business had contributed to the war business, to the war effort. But the Adana shop in Church Street had only 2 staff, with virtually nothing to sell. Despite this, Peter Holmes, one of the directors, and his secretary went in Monday to Friday throughout the war. Quite what they did, I'm not sure. Shuffled paper, I guess. In June 1941, Two visitors arrived at the now virtually empty Twickenham showroom. They were Norwegian, and they wanted to speak confidentially with the man in charge. The men needed printing presses, small, portable, relatively lightweight, easy to conceal. These were to be dropped behind enemy lines to aid the resistance movements across Europe, initially in Norway and Sweden. Peter Holmes told the men he had nothing to offer, but they caught sight of a dismembered flatbed press, and they asked if they might borrow it for a few days. He agreed, and they returned a week later with the machine, which had been sawn in half and fitted with a lightweight aluminium ink plate. They wanted another 50. Holmes advertised in various newspapers, offering to buy back pre-war presses, and he was summoned to the War Office for a meeting, and agreement was reached to modify 50 second-hand flatbeds to be dropped over Europe by the RAF. That folding flatbed actually went into production eventually after the war, and it was called the QFB, the Quarto Flatbed 1945. In April 1946, a new Adana emerged from the ashes of Aspinall's pre-war business. Adana Printing Machines Limited was registered at Company's House on St. George's Day 1946, although the first post-war catalogue had actually appeared the previous autumn. That's on display downstairs. In 1947, Fred Ayers designed a new treadle press, which could also be fitted with an electric motor. He called it the TP47. All of the early production models were destined for export. Times were tough, materials were in short supply. At one stage, accessories such as composing sticks would only be sold if you bought a press. You couldn't just walk in and buy accessories. As the supply problems eased, the new press was made available to home markets, and it was renamed the TP48. A modified version called the P71, launched in 1971, didn't sell nearly as well. It was essentially just a cosmetic improvement. And as many of the original presses were still in fine fettle, it probably depressed the market for the P71. A cheap treadle press was also launched in 1956. The Adana 9.6 was essentially a larger version of the 8.5 with a flywheel. I was told by the shop manager, the late Phyllis Richardson, that a child was injured using one of these in school, and the press was rapidly withdrawn. We have one at St. Bride here, next door in storage. Sadly, we can't show it in the exhibition, as those safety features are still lacking, and it might bite your fingers off. In 1948, a new quarterly magazine appeared. Printcraft was packed with interesting articles and advice for budding letterpress enthusiasts. It was a lively little magazine with a cover price of 1 shilling and 6pence. The lack of letterpress innovation means that many of the articles remain relevant today. Printcraft was the brainchild of Peter Holmes, the man that the Norwegian representatives spoke to during the war. He was a busy man with many responsibilities within the Adana organization. So the task of editing a magazine was potentially onerous. Holmes designated himself the editorial director, and he found the perfect editor in a man called John William Wheway. Now, John Wheway was a prolific writer who could sit down at a typewriter and bash out 10,000 words at a single sitting. But he used a dozen or more professional pseudonyms. To readers of Printcraft, he was Mrs. Printer, Vincent Armitage, David Wesley, Winchester, and a dozen others. But to readers of school adventure stories, he was Anne Gilmore, Gladys Cotterill, the maiden name of his first wife, Diana Martin, Heather Granger, Hazel Armitage, Audrey Nichols, it goes on and on. He was also the man who turned Bessie Bunter from an unappealing, overweight glutton into a lovable, likable rogue. Now, Bessie Bunter was created by the author Frank Richards as the sister of Billy Bunter. But Frank Richards' workload was so enormous, he simply couldn't keep up with the requirements of the various comics and magazines. So he handed Bessie Bunter over to John Wheway, who transformed this rather unlikable creature into somebody who, over 500 stories, became much more popular than her brother, Billy Bunter. As Adana entered the 1950s, the machine range was expanded to include guillotines and a thermograph designed to produce raised printing which imitated die stamping. The high-speed number 3 press was launched in 1950, but was perhaps too expensive at 25 guineas, and that was phased out 3 years later. In April 1953, almost 70 years ago, a brand new tabletop press called the Adana 8.5 was launched. At 16 guineas, it was affordable. Hire purchase was offered, and the machines flew off the shelves. The waiting list was 12 weeks at one stage. And in 1956, a baby brother, the Adana 5.3, appeared, which was almost as popular. The classic pre-war flatbed press was completely redesigned and launched as the Adana Quarto Horizontal. Phyllis Richardson, no relation to me, but Phyllis was the manageress in the shop in Church Street for many, many years. She told me of a phone call she received during the Adana telephone operator's lunch break one day in the late 1950s. A cultured voice said, "Good morning, I'm calling from Buckingham Palace." And Phil's reply was, "Yes, of course you are, dear, and I'm Princess Margaret." Well, it really was the palace, and they wanted an Adana 8.5 for the Royal Yacht Britannia to print menus for the dining room. Sensing an opportunity to promote Adana and perhaps even obtain a royal warrant, Fred Ayers had a special wooden storage unit, polished mahogany, brass bound, which was delivered to the ship. And an expert called Mr. Radford went along to teach the crew how to set type and print menus. So yes, even the Queen had an Adana 8.5. This was a very regal Adana press. I tried to track it down. The Royal Yacht Britannia came out of service many years ago. I even had a letter published in Navy News, the Royal Navy's own staff newspaper, but the mystery still hasn't been resolved. Somebody has it. Where it is, I don't know. I hope that one day it might turn up. Fred Ayers also set up a subsidiary company called Ayers Jardine to make a large flatbed press aimed at department stores for the production of point-of-sale graphics and price tickets. It was a direct competitor for the market leader, made by a company called Mass & Seeley, who produced the Mass Seeley hot foil press from 1918 onwards. Although it was a good little proofing press, the Ayers Jardine show card press used ink rather than Massili's dry hot foil process. It was messy, requiring several different rollers for multicolor work, with all the incumbent cleanup problems. Massili actually poked fun at Adana in a cartoon from their staff magazine. That cartoon is downstairs next to the show card machine in the exhibition. The machine didn't generate much income for Adana. In fact, in 1973, the accounts showed a net profit of just £13 for that subsidiary. And on the 13th of December, 1985, Ayers Jardine was removed from the register at Companies House. A young graphic designer called John Ryder had purchased an Adana flatbed before the war, and he now upgraded to a redesigned model. He was never very impressed by the inking mechanism, but he found the printing operation of the flatbed, the Quarto Horizontal, very satisfactory. He wrote an instruction manual for budding printers, which he called Printing for Pleasure. In the first edition, Ryder lists 12 presses which are perfect for amateurs. 5 of those were made by Adana, including the new 9.6 treadle machine, which bites fingers off. Printing for Pleasure was reprinted many times, including as part of the Teach Yourself series of manuals. Ryder extensively revised the text, and a new edition appeared in 1976. His enthusiasm for letterpress saw him setting up his own small private press called the Miniature Press, and promoted the craft to others. In 1960, he organized a collaborative project called the Miniature Folio of Private Presses. 44 printers were invited to participate. 28 of them sent submissions, and a copy of Ryder's portfolio is downstairs in the exhibition on display. There were only 28 of them. You had to contribute in order to receive one, so it's a very limited print run. Incidentally, one of the contributions downstairs was printed by Susan Shaw, founder of the Type Archive at the Merrion Press, her private press. Adana also added their own instruction manual to its portfolio of publications, The Beginner's Guide to Design in Printing, published in 1961. That was followed by two others. 1963 saw Printing as a Hobby by J. Ben Lieberman. That was the book that got me interested in letterpress. As a, how old would I be? 8-year-old, 8 or 9 years old. Herbert Simon's Introduction to Printing, The Craft of Letterpress, appeared in 1968. Incidentally, Herbert Simon's technical consultant on that title was the great Bert Smith, the virtuoso compositor from Kirwan Press. Adana thrived during the 1960s and 70s, exporting to 80 countries around the world. They had agents in every major city around the globe. They were big in Japan, Italy, Australia, Spain, Canada, Nigeria. They were everywhere. Adana sales reps like John Alexander, the manager who had had to close the pre-war Fleet Street showroom at the outbreak of war, traveled around the world to trade fairs, selling the little red and silver presses to printers worldwide. Record profits were recorded. A network of domestic distributors was also established. I'm a Geordie from Newcastle upon Tyne, and I remember the big display window of Van der Velde in Pilgrim Street being filled with Adana machines when I was about 12 or 13 years old. I was 15 when I bought my first press in October 1970. Other distributors in the UK included Crowstone Commercial Art in Westcliff-on-Sea and E.W. Massey in Dublin. They even issued their own version of the Adana catalogues, overprinted with their names. Now, if imitation is really the sincerest form of flattery, then Adana has been flattered worldwide. By the 1960s, an Indian version of the No. 2 high speed was being pirated by the Manna Engineering Company. And more recently, in the land of the rising sun, a press uncannily like the 8.5 has been cited. The Japanese even borrowed the name and called it the Adana 21A, believing Adana to be a generic name to describe any small tabletop press. So they say. In the same way that Hoover or Tannoy was used generically for vacuum cleaners and public address systems. When they were challenged, they said, "We have used the name Adana as a general term to honor the great Mr. Donald Aspinall who designed this great machine." An attempt to register the Adana trademark in Japan was rejected by their National Patent Office on the basis that Adana is recognized to express the name of fourth largest city in Turkey and cannot be copyrighted in Japan. Incidentally, you can't buy an Adana Japanese press in this country. They are not exported outside of Japan. Even if you did want to buy one, they are about a third more expensive than the British version, so it doesn't make any economic sense even to consider that. Although Adana doesn't have anything to do with Turkey, there is another country, a kingdom in fact, which captures the essence of what Adana printing is all about. It is the kingdom of Adana land, which flourishes in a curious time warp somewhere in the south of England, peacefully existing in a period of calm and tranquility between the two world wars, the two great wars. Like Brigadoon, the kingdom of Adana land occasionally interfaces with the 21st century. Adana land is the brilliant creation of Alan Brignall, the proprietor of the Hedgehog Press, who has established a perfect virtual state. I'd certainly be happy to retire there. Adana land has its own postal system. And in the cabinets downstairs, you can see some of the postage stamps issued by Postmaster General Alan Brignall. Inspiration for the whole of Adana land is largely drawn from those 280 rather quirky blocks which I mentioned. There are so many other enthusiasts, Adana enthusiasts, worthy of mention, but we only have an hour. And I'll briefly mention Nick Hand of the Adana bike, which has traveled from Bristol to Mainz in Germany and from John O'Groats to Land's End with an Adana 8.5 printing along the way. A professional printer once confided in me, "Don't mention Adana, they're toys for kids." Well, they're toys used by Rolls-Royce and Glaxo, Wedgwood, the Leeds Building Society, the Post Office, the Royal British Legion, and the BBC. Toys I think not. The BBC transcription unit used a bevy of Adana presses from the mid-1930s, printing record labels for radio programs sold abroad on disc. This is Mrs. Luyton Lucas of the transcription department, setting type and printing record labels in 1941. You can see the finished labels piled up next to her Adana high-speed number 2. BBC transcription was still doing this in 1985, using Adana 8.5 presses. Glaxo in Greenford added batch numbers and expiry dates to glossy, full-colour packaging for pharmaceuticals. Building societies overprinted passbooks. Impoverished students, like me, printed dance tickets for discos to pay college fees. And for many years, the British Legion, the Royal British Legion, had a legion of Adana presses at their poppy factory in Richmond, fitted with cutting dies instead of blocks or type, to stamp out the poppies which were sold around Armistice Day. Those presses proved rather hard to sell when the production switched to other methods, because as they had never been used with ink, they were purchased without ink discs, so they weren't much good for letterpress printing. The Adana 8.5 was redesigned several times, with the last major change in 1965, although there was a later hot foil adaptation, although it struggled to compete with dedicated hot foil machines. Frederick Ayers suffered a stroke in April 1969, and the running of the business was taken over by his son, Ronald, one of the UK's top aeronautical engineers. Yes, Adana in the 70s was run by a rocket scientist. Fred Ayers did some work from home. He managed the occasional visit to see his old staff team, but he died on New Year's Eve in 1981. Ronald Ayers led the company through the 1970s and the 80s. There were very few new innovations in the 80s. A steady decline in letterpress had resulted in the winding up of Ayers Jardine. The central London showrooms at number 8 Gray's Inn Road were demolished and relocated to number 162. As letterpress went into decline, sales slumped. Adana didn't diversify into other printing technologies. A prototype business card machine didn't go into large-scale production. And the showrooms at number 15 to 19 Church Street, which we saw earlier, were demolished and redeveloped. Adana had a short lease on another property in Church Street at number 28, but moved to an industrial estate in Felton in the final years of the company's existence. In 1987, discussions began with Caslon about the sale of Adana, and in 1988, Adana Limited became a subsidiary of Caslon. A radical restructuring of the company was needed if it was to survive, and that interim company was also wound up too in 1993. Adana Mail Order emerged as a leaner, fitter company and still trades today as part of Caslon. Remarkably, the market for the Adana 8.5 has seen a significant upturn in recent years. Caslon inherited a vast collection of spare parts with the acquisition of Fred Ayers' company, and this allowed top-class refurbishment of the existing machines purchased second-hand for resale. The market for the 8.5 picked up a momentum, and sales remained buoyant. Although many components remained on the shelves at Caslon, some parts had become exhausted, and the second-hand market failed to provide sufficient quantities of components. So there was only one solution: start up production of the classic tabletop press again. In 2016, the Adana 8.5 went back into production, 25 years after the last machine rolled off the production line. But the 21st century 8.5 needed to do much more than its predecessor. Letterpress had changed, and the perfect kiss impression, which applied a pristine print to the surface with no debossing, was not what 21st century users want. They wanted to be able to feel the impression. A perfect print, God forbid, might be mistaken for a laser copy. This new machine was renamed the Adana 8.5C, C for Caslon, and the mainframe was thickened to accommodate much deeper impression. Components likely to be stressed by heavy impression were reinforced, and the new 8.5 is probably, as Carlsberg might say, the best vertical platen press in the world. So, to conclude, as Adana celebrates its centenary, we should remember Donald Aspinall, that young Tommy who started it all 100 years ago, and tip our hats to Caslon, who are carrying the Adana torch into the next century of trading. So thank you to Donald, to Fred, to Roy Caslon, and to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. I never fail to sit and love listening to hear you speak about everything you can ever think about. And the depth of your research is incredible. So thank you so much from all of us for the effort you put into making this talk so
Thanks,
brilliant.
Thank you.
We have got time for questions. We've got a few comments online, which I'll go to in a minute. We've actually got Roy online with us today, and Nick Hand as well, so we're truly joined by lots of people in the talk. And if anyone, before I forget, if anyone is interested in finding more out about Nick Hand and his Letterpress bike, he spoke to us sometime last year, and you can see a recording of the talk on our YouTube channel. I think it's called The Power of Print, and it's worth watching to hear about all the other brilliant contributors as well. So just so everyone can hear us at home, if anyone does have a question, I will need you to speak into the mic. So Keith, I'll hand over to you first.
First, Bob, thank you for reminding us about the less protein man in Oxford Street, because truly you could hardly ever go there without passing him. But I wondered, what happened to the attractive Adana sign on Gray's Inn Road premises? Do you remember that?
Yes, it survives. In fact, that sign was commissioned in 1950 for the original shop in Gray's Inn Road, and when the shop transferred to number 162, the sign was moved. Now, Mr. Shah, who bought the business, it's a complicated story, but in 1987, when Adana was sold to Caslon, the shop was sold under a separate deal to an independent trader who was given permission to continue using the name Adana. Although he sold some Adana stock initially, he very quickly turned the shop into a quick print business. That building was demolished, in the process of being demolished, and Mr. Shah relocated to City Road, and he has taken the sign with him. When I saw the demolition notice on the shop in Gray's Inn Road, I got in touch with him. I rang him up and said, what's happening to the sign? Because we could have probably squeezed it in somewhere in the reading room. But he said, the sign is mine and it's going to the new shop, and it's still there, so you can see it.
Brilliant, thank you, Bob. I'm just going to go over to our Zoom participants. We've got just a couple of comments, really, that I thought would be nice to share. So Thomas Gravemaker has joined us and said, nice anecdote. I think you were talking about John. He ended up working at the Bodley Head in the 1980s when he lived in London and became good friends with John. So in March, he'll be at the Bodleian Library printing a homage to John, which would be really lovely. And Richard Caslon piped up and said brilliantly that Adanas are also used by the Bank of England and other currency printers around the world. So that's brilliant. And just bear with me while I get used to working on a PC and scrolling, which is not my forte. Sorry about this. There we go. Let's see if there are any more questions at the moment. I think there's just some lovely comments which I won't read. So do we have any more questions in the room? Yes.
Hello, and yeah, thanks for this. It's fascinating. One of the ads said 1,000 copies an hour. What's the real number?
Depends what you're printing, really. Probably, I think, 800 if you're using one of the manual machines. But the Adana TP48 had a rotary speed control. That was one of the powered machines. And you could actually crank it up to 1,600 impressions an hour. I wouldn't even try to feed the machine at that speed because the dwell time is so short. You know, you're looking to lose a few fingers. But 800 comfortably. I think 1,000 is really struggling. I took on a job on my Adana many years ago for a charity called Birthright, who wanted 5,000 membership cards. And after the first 2,000, The palm of my hand had completely gone. In fact, I had to wear a rubber glove with cotton wool inside because the blister had burst and it was pretty grim. So 800 okay. Realistically.
Right. For the sake of comparison, it took me 4 days to do 2,000 copies, 4 evenings.
Yeah.
I think I averaged about 250 an hour. So I wanted to see how far behind I was. But clearly I'm far behind if you can do 800.
The original flatbed machine, James Richard, who printed the Gospel according to St. Mark, he had a full form of type. You need a lot of impression to print 2 pages side by side. And apparently he used to climb up and stand on the table and stand on the press and jump up and down on it in order to get that sort of impression. So you're not going to do 1,000 copies an hour if you have to keep climbing onto a table.
I think we had a question over here somewhere, yeah.
Thanks, Bob. It was a great talk. Thanks very much. The Japanese model.
Yeah.
I heard a story that the body wasn't cast. It was just straight up steel, and that's why it didn't do so well. Is that correct?
Yes, they made a prototype. The first machine was called the Adana 21J, and it's made from slabs of aluminium. It's actually bolted together it's about 3/4 inch thick aluminium slabs. I think that was always intended to be a prototype, but the first big production model, the 21A, is cast in the same way as the British Adana press. But they've subsequently done 2 or 3 other versions. I mean, they have a website, which is all in Japanese, but I did email them a few years ago and said, if I wanted to buy one, what will it cost me, and what's the shipping charges? And I had a very polite email back to say, we do not sell outside of Japan under any circumstances. So they're
what was that
keeping
due to? Do you know?
Sorry?
What was that due to? Do you know?
Well, I think they were on very thin ice because the Adana trademarks belong to Caslon.
Yeah.
The design of the Adana press belongs to Caslon as well. It's a British success. It's a British machine. They were probably on the wrong side of the law, and I'm guessing they may have realized that. So they've kept it very much as a domestic product.
And one last question. I've got a couple of Adanas myself. One is the 8x5, the later model, but there was the previous model which had the spring-loaded roller attachments.
Yeah. There were 3 8.5s.
Was there 3?
Yeah, and they were quite different. You had to get, when you were ordering spare parts in the 1960s and 70s, you had to send the serial number details to Adana, and they would provide the relevant springs or bolts or whatever piece you needed. But some of them were specific to a particular model. Sadly, when Caslon acquired Adana, as I understand it, all the serial number records were destroyed. So unfortunately, I think Roy may have built up a sort of database because he's dealt with the Adana machines over the last 30 years or so. But a lot of the original records were not transferred.
Wow. Thank you.
I'm just going to check to see if we've got any more questions online. Bear with me. I'd just like to say there's loads of love in the room online, the virtual room for you, Bob. I think that's it. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. I would just like to say a huge thank you to all the St. Bride staff who work behind the scenes really hard to make this happen and possible and brilliant. You're all amazing. You know who you are. Huge thanks to our live streaming team who've done a fantastic job. And finally, I think this brilliant man, as he is now known as Brilliant Bob, forever and always. Just one last round of applause, and thank you all for joining us in room and online. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.